story of your chapter starts with Herodotus. What an amazing character, and as a historian, a very important person, because he travels around and does an inquiry, and he writes a book about this inquiry, this investigation. The Greek word history of what? Well, two different things is what he's writing about. And what the introduction of your chapter is talking about is his history of the Greek people, both the biggest city-states in ancient Greece at this time, in the 5th century BCE, of Sparta and Athens. And he talks about them by looking at this bigger shadow that engulfs the whole region with this large empire, over 35 million people, and that is Persia. Persia, with its culture that everyone tried to emulate, including the Greeks. Herodotus is obsessed with the Persians, and Persia has its massive cities like Babylon and Susa and Persepolis, where everyone has to bring and pay homage to the king that they call the King of Kings. And that's Darius the First, the other ones after him. If you've seen the movie 300, this is that big Persian Empire there, but the real Persian Empire that is so much better than the comic version of the movie. But this is what Herodotus is obsessed with. This is what the Greeks are obsessed with. And that's such an important concept when you think of Greece as the founders of Western civilization, right? There's classes at Shasta College, there's a class of Western philosophy. And you start with what? You start with ancient Greece. But you got to understand that the identity of these people in the 5th century BCE weren't trying to start a whole new Western civilization. They're trying to emulate which was the most powerful civilization to them, and that is Persia. That is what that meant everything. So when these little tiny Ionian little colonies of Greece resist against this massive Persian Empire, this is like throwing a pebble in a large lake. It created a ripple, but it was ridiculous at the time. And it was even more ridiculous that Athens backed them up. And what they backed up and what created was the Persian Wars. And that's the other thing that Herodotus talks about in his histories. He talks about the span of this wars that happened in the 5th century BC against Persia. This massive empire of 35 million people. Athens had 300,000 people in the city. In all of Greece, and with all the city-states combined, there's no more than 2 to 3 million people. And they're fighting this massive empire. And that's where you get that image in the movie 300, if you're familiar with it. And that's pretty good if you see the size of what's happening. So it's amazing of what comes out of this and how a new civilization kind of emerges and a new empire starts to take form by clashing of two powers, a superpower with the Persians, and then another power of Greece in its city-states, fractioned but creating something new. And how that starts to be unified with this Macedonian Empire, which Alexander, and how his empire of Alexander the Great starts to spread and take over what is most of Persia, and even beyond, creating even the more larger and incorporated empire that collapses with his death and is fragmented and split, and creates different cultures that starts to be a huge, important part of the identity of the regions, and starts to be encompassed when Rome comes in there. So it all starts to play an effect, and a domino effect, but it starts with these two clashes of Persia and Greece. So this chapter, and what I want to talk about is highlight a few things that's happening in this chapter and some backstory. So please pay attention. I hope you're able to watch it. And it should put more substance into what we're talking about here, and a very fascinating story of ancient Persia with Zoroastrianism as the religion, which is a fascinating religion that unifies this Persian Empire and is able to use religion, just like we've seen in other parts of civilizations prior to this classical age, but also Greece and their philosophies and their different government structures that start to create something different. So we have to talk about the Persian Empire. It's an important story and part of the identities that emerge in this classical period, and what comes out of it with this little tiny speck of a place here in Greece that with their colonies in the areas down along here that throw a pebble into this massive pond, this massive lake of the Persian Empire. So what happens with that and the clash that happens, this catastrophic reaction that changes the course of history. So the Persian Empire, starting with a really important part of the Achaemenid dynasty that lasts from about 550 BCE and goes to 330 BCE, was a flexible empire with flexible government systems, with the satraps, with governors as the satraps and the satrapies of the different regions, that were able to effectively create a grassroots government, you can say, a local government, where they collected taxes. They were able to send troops to Susa, to the major capital of Susa, or Babylon, or to Persepolis, where major homage would be paid and given to the kings. Namely Darius. Darius the First, a major king and a major organizer of this massive empire. And he got his ideas. He was able to create a lot of his identity of how to rule and what it meant to be part of this Persian Empire by looking at the past, looking at the Assyrian empires, looking at people like Hammurabi. And what did he create? He created, of course, his laws. And so Darius, being called the law, the king of kings, who created the law of the kings, right? That's what Hammurabi called as well. Demanding tributes of taxation, tributes of soldiers to fill the armies, to conquer more lands. And with these kind of empires, if it's not growing, it's dying. And so it's all about expansion. It's all about conquering and retaining their own culture, their traditions, their way of life, and able to bring it to all to the region of the Parade of Nations in Persepolis. So these regions able to maintain their own identity, yet also pay tribute and understand that there is an overarching shadow of identity, an umbrella that engulfed this whole entire region of 35 million people, with the foundation and central role of the religion of the monotheistic religion, Zoroastrianism. Zoroastrianism, founded by the prophet Zarathustra, it's a world governed by both good and evil. It talks about the supreme deity, Ahura Mazda, who gave birth to two different deities, one good, one bad, and each person had to prepare themselves on earth for a day of judgment when they would meet the Lord of Truth. Yeah? So some of this might sound familiar. In fact, they'd spend eternity in Paradisa, Paradisa, where we get the word paradise, or eternal garden. So it's all about this garden, this perfect garden, this eternal garden without sin. And they talk about sin. They talk about what it means to worship this God, Ahura Mazda. And there's all these praise songs to them. And the big sort of debate that you see among scholars, and you might have heard it yourself when you look at Zoroastrianism, is this clash between religions, between monotheisms, of what role did Zoroastrianism play in affecting and influencing Hebrewism, which would become Judaism, which would become the foundation of Christianity, and what role did each play in sort of affecting each other. It's very clear. There's evidence that Zoroastrianism's praises, many of them are the exact same as some of the Psalms. So there's debate of who came first. That is up to you. It's beyond the scope of our class in this sense, but it's an important thing to talk about. And it's an interesting concept of all these religions clashing and interacting, these people interacting, and these systems of exchange. One thing is how to worship. And what role did you pick up a psalm that the Hebrews are talking and singing to their God, Yahweh, and then these Zoroastrianisms are saying, that's a good thing. We have a monotheistic God. Let's incorporate them into Ahura Mazda. Or was it reverse? That's a huge debate among religious scholars. And it's an important thing to think about. All we know in this context of this class, and the important thing is how much and how effective this monotheistic religion was able to bring together and to work like glue in this huge, massive empire of peoples. So you have the Persian perception of kingship that starts to emerge, where they had these huge billboards, if you will. This is an ancient one that it used to say there, and these are people who shows the importance of writing as well, the importance of literacy. But it was like a billboard to Zoroastrianism. It was a billboard to the king that said, "These are the countries which are subject to me by the grace of Ahura Mazda. I became king of them all. Within these lands, whoever was friend, him I surely protect. Whomever hostile, I have, and I will destroy." And these billboards were placed all along the empire, along the royal road, so people were able to always see who was the king and how much Ahura Mazda was able to, this monotheistic God was able to give him the power. So I want to highlight the important part of how the Persian Wars, both the first and second one, especially the second one, had to shift this obsession with Persia to emulate them, to now protect them so they weren't wiped out by them. And so all the resources had to go into defeating this massive superpower. So that's where you have the story of Xerxes and Darius' successor and son, who the Battle of Thermopylae. That's where the movie 300 comes from, and the second 300 was Salamis, with the naval battle of Athenian naval battle with their the trireme, which I have the trireme, the strength of the Athenian power. The hoplite being the strength of the land power of the Spartans. But all the resources went into how important it was for these Greek city-states to now unite. And they united under what was known, and you read about with the Delian League. Formation of this league was to realize that they can't fight separately and apart. They have to put away their differences and have a common enemy. This is the theme that you hear throughout world history, is how identities are formed by othering, by having a different enemy to fight. So what united Greece the most is the same thing that split them apart for so long, right? They were trying to emulate the Persian Empire in their own ways. Now, the last thing I want to talk about in under 2 minutes, which is horrific, but that is the rise of Macedonians, and that is the rise of Alexander the Great, of what will diffuse of Hellenistic culture, spreading culture across the empire. So it begins with Philip of Macedonia, who unifies and conquers the neighboring polis around him in 340 BCE, becomes the ruler. Shortly thereafter, he is assassinated, which sets the stage of Alexander the Great, again, being trained by Aristotle and other great thinkers of the time. But his main ambition is to take down, again, looking east to the Persian Empire of Darius the Third. So trying to take, always a threat that the Persians are going to come. They become the boogeyman, where they could come at any time. And Alexander the Great tries to nip that by unifying Greece under his rule and spreading and creating an empire that would spread beyond the Persian Empire and even further up to India, where he would then die. But his whole motivation, the motivation of Greece to unify, the motivation of Greece to fight against the Persians, was Persia themselves. Persia was the main key to this whole region and to the domino effects of events. Everyone tried to emulate them. Then when the Greeks defeated them, everyone was fearful of them, creating a whole new emperor, a whole new empire to arise. After the death of Alexander the Great, everything fell, and his generals created these different regions of a sphere of influences that you read about. And what was spread and what was left behind in the wake of this empire was Greek culture, Hellenistic culture. So it started as the Persian Empire that everyone looked to, everyone was drawn to, turned into conflict with these small little city-states, these polis of Greece, that created an all-out conflict, ending in the rise of powerful city-states, powerful polis like Athens, and then later Macedonia, that would then create an empire of its of unprecedented size, beyond the size of Persia, beyond the size of anything else seen in the classical world, that spread across the lands of Persia, up into India, and throughout the Middle East with Alexander the Great. When Alexander the Great died, he left in his own shadow, a Hellenistic culture that had great influence across the lands that he touched, with religion and identities of the people now changed. So with religion, identities of the people, with a Hellenistic touch that you're going to talk about in your last discussion of this week. But let me leave you with the words of Alexander the Great, who said, "May God keep you away from the venom of the cobra, from the teeth of the tiger, and the revenge of the Afghans."